Walls by John Bellairs, Chapter 7. It rained a lot in New Zebedee that November. Cold rain fell steadily through each night and left the sidewalk a glaze of ice in the morning. Louis sat in his window seat and watched the rain peck at the chipped slates of the front porch roof. He felt sick inside. It was an empty, black feeling in the pit of his stomach. He was eaten up with guilt and remorse because he knew what he had done, or thought he knew at any rate. He had let Mrs. Izzard out of her tomb, and now she had stolen the key that wound up the magic clock ticking in the walls of Jonathan's house, ticking away morning, noon, and night, sometimes loud, sometimes soft, but always there. What was going to happen? How could anyone stop her? Had she used the key? What would happen if she did? Louis had no answers for any of these questions. It might have helped if he had been able to talk the whole matter over with Jonathan, but then he would have had to admit what he had done, and Louis was afraid to do that. It was not that Uncle Jonathan was such a hard man to talk to. He was easier to talk to than most people Louis knew, easier by far than Louis's own father had ever been. Then why was Louis afraid? Well, he was afraid because he was afraid. Maybe it was because his mother had once threatened to send him to the detention home when he was bad. The detention home was a big white house on the outskirts of the town that Louis and his parents had lived in. It stood on a high hill and had bars and chicken wire over the windows. Bad boys and girls were sent there, at least that's what everyone said. Louis had never known anyone who had actually gotten sent there. Of course, Louis's mother would never have sent him there for being bad, not really, but Louis didn't know that, and now when Louis thought of telling his uncle about Halloween night, he thought of the detention home, and he was afraid. It wasn't a reasonable fear, considering the kind of man Jonathan was. But Louis had not known him very long, and anyway, people are not always so reasonable. But there was another thing that added to Louis's despair. He had lost Tarby. He had lost him in spite of all his sneaking and planning, or maybe he had lost him because of it. It was one thing to say that you could raise the dead, but when you did it, well, ordinary people never cared much for the company of wizards. Tarby was afraid of Louis now, or else he was enjoying himself with the other boys, the boys who could hit home runs and catch fly balls. Whatever way it was, Louis had not seen Tarby since Halloween night. The month wore on. The rain kept falling, and nothing mysterious or evil happened until one day, the 3rd of December it was, when the Hanchets moved out. The Hanchets lived across the street from Uncle Jonathan in a boxy dark brown house with tiny windows, the kind of windows that have little diamond-shaped panes that swing out instead of sliding up and down. The Hanchets were a friendly middle-aged couple, and they liked Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman a lot, but one morning they were gone. A couple of days after their disappearance, a truck came, and a couple of movers in gray uniforms packed all the Hanchets' furniture into it and drove off. A real estate man came around and hung a big red and white sign on their front door. The sign said, "Hi there, I'm for sale. Call Bishop Barlow Realtors. Phone 865. Bishop Barlow was not a real bishop. Bishop was just his first name. Louis knew the man. He was a fat loudmouth who wore sunglasses all the time, even on rainy days. He smoked cheap, smelly cigars and wore sport coats that looked like awnings. Jonathan seemed really upset about the departure of the Hanchets. He phoned their son, who was a lawyer in OC5 Hills, and found out that the Hanchets were living with him. The frightened couple would not talk to Jonathan over the phone, and they seemed to blame him for whatever had made them leave. The son did not seem to know much about the matter. He muttered something about ghosts and messing around with magic and hung up. One day, Louis was walking home from school when he saw a small moving van up in front of the empty Hanchett home. The big black letters on the side of the van said, "Terminus Movers Incorporated." Louis was about to cross the street and watch the men unload the truck when he realized with a shock that he knew the driver. It was Hammerhandle. All the children in New Zebedee knew Hammerhandle, and if they were smart, they were afraid of him. He was a mean old hobo who lived in a tar-paper shack down by the railroad tracks, and he had a reputation for being able to foretell the future. Louis had stood once on the outskirts of a crowd of kids gathered around the door of Hammerhandle's shack on a hot summer day. He remembered seeing Hammerhandle seated in the doorway on a broken kitchen chair. He was telling stories about the world's last night, which, if you believed him, was not far off. Behind Hammerhandle, in the disorder and darkness of the old shack, stood ranks of smooth yellow poles, axe handles, hoe handles, hammer handles. He made them and sold them. That was how he got his name. Lewis stood there wondering what he was doing driving a moving van. Hammerhandle slammed the door on the driver's side and walked across the street. He looked around him quickly and then grabbed Lewis by the collar. His bristly face was close to Lewis's now, and his breath smelled of whiskey and tobacco. "What the hell are you staring at, kid?" Nothing. I just like to watch people moving in." It was getting dark, and Lewis wondered if anyone could see him. If he yelled, would Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman come? Hammerhandle let go of Lewis's collar. "Look, kid," he said in his harsh, scraping voice. "You just keep your nose on your side of the fence, eh? And that goes for your fat uncle, too. Just don't bother me, okay?" He glared at Lewis, turned, and went back to the truck. Lewis stood there trembling for a few moments. He was sweating all over. Then he turned and ran in through the open gate, up the walk, and into the house. "Uncle Jonathan! Uncle Jonathan!" he shouted. He yanked open the doors of the study and looked. No Jonathan. He shouted into the front parlor and into the kitchen and up the stairwell. At last, Uncle Jonathan appeared at the top of the stairs. He was wearing his bathrobe, which was made in the shape of the robes professors wear at graduation ceremonies, black with red stripes on the sleeves. In one hand he held a dripping, long-handled scrub brush. In the other he held the book he had been reading in the tub. "Yes, Lewis, what is it?" He sounded cross at first, but when he saw the state that Lewis was in, he dropped the book and the brush and clumped down the stairs and threw his arms around the boy. It was a damp embrace, but it felt good to Lewis. "Lewis, my boy," said Jonathan, kneeling in front of him. "What in the name of heaven is wrong? You look awful." Lewis, stuttering and breaking down several times, told Jonathan what had happened. When he was through, he watched Jonathan's expression change. There was a hard, angry look on his face now, but his anger was not directed at Lewis. He stood up, knotted his bathrobe tighter about him, and stalked to the front door. For a minute, Lewis thought Jonathan was going out to challenge Hammerhandle right then and there, but he merely opened the front door and stared across at the Hanchett house. The workmen were just hitching up the tailgate and getting ready to drive off. Apparently, there hadn't been much to unload. With folded arms, Jonathan watched the truck drive away. "I might have known he'd be in on it," he said bitterly. Lewis stared up at his uncle. He didn't have the faintest idea what was going on, and for some reason he was afraid of to ask what Jonathan meant. That evening at supper, Lewis asked Jonathan why Hammerhandle had acted so mean. Jonathan threw down his fork and said angrily, "Because he's mean, that's why. Do you have to have explanations? Just stay away from him and you'll be all right. And stay away, oh, I don't know what I mean." He got up and stomped out of the room. Lewis heard the study doors slam. Mrs. Zimmerman reached across the table and laid her hand gently on Lewis's. "Don't worry, Lewis," she said. "He's not angry at you, but he does have a lot on his mind these days, and he hasn't been getting much sleep. Come on over to my house and we'll have a game of chess." "Okay." Lewis was grateful for the suggestion. They played chess till 10 o'clock at night, and since Lewis won most of the games, he was in a happy mood when he went home. Upstairs, he saw a line of light under the door of Jonathan's bedroom. He decided not to disturb him. When he had gotten ready for bed, Lewis went to his window seat, sat down, and pulled back the heavy curtain. It was a bright, cold, starry night. The water tower on the top of the hill glimmered in the moonlight, and the rows of the houses were dark, pointed shadows. There were lights on in the houses that stood on either side of the Hanchett house, and in one window Lewis saw the gray aquarium glow of one of those new television sets. Jonathan hadn't gotten one yet. The Hanchett house seemed to lie in deep shadow, except for faint patches of moonlight on the roof. By the light of a street lamp, Lewis could see that there was a car parked in the driveway. He was about to close the curtain and go to bed when the porch light of the Hanchett house came on. The two frosted panes of the front door glowed yellow. Then one of the panels of the door moved inward. Someone stepped out on the front stoop. Lewis watched as whoever it was stood there, taking in the frosty air of the December night. He thought he caught the faint glitter of spectacles, but he couldn't be sure at this distance. After a little while, the dark figure went inside and pushed the door shut. The hall light went out. Lewis sat there for a while, thinking, then he lowered the curtain and went to bed. And that's the end of Chapter 7.